the story?
I have to actually, take down the placard so they'll be able to see you and make sure they can hear you, but you're all set? You got
Okay.
what you need?
I have
Okay.
everything I need except what people want to hear about.
Okay, well, you can start talking
I
to the
will.
folks, but give me a second.
I'm going to start talking because I want to ask some
Go ahead.
questions.
Sure.
So there's a lot in this book. I have some context for basically where I came from, and then I get into mostly sort of my history really quickly. The first 70 or so pages get me to, I think, Chicago. So it includes some of the people that I know here, Wisconsin and Madison and then Racine. But then I get into Chicago, and there's really two parts to that. There's being organizing as an activist and working under the direction with a group of people, white people, Intercommunal Survival Committee, under the direction of the Black Panther Party. And then that's about a decade, a little over. And then there is transition, being part of citywide coalitions that ultimately resulted in the election of Harold Washington, who was not just the first black mayor, but a pretty extraordinary politician, which I could get into if you're interested. And then there's lots of stories embedded in them, and I kind of wrote the book as stories connected with each other. I tried to, really wanted it to sound like a novel. I think sometimes I may have succeeded, sometimes not. Things have changed so much that there's a lot of contextual information in there, and I tried not to make it too dense, but I've been told it's pretty dense. And I promise you that if whatever I do read, I will not get into all the names, and I'll skip a few things because, you include a lot of people because they're going to read it, but no one here is going to know most, although some people do know them, it turns out. So I'm telling you all that to try and figure out what you might be interested in, or what area or era or what kind of thing. Some people have said they're more interested in hearing about how I transitioned from an activist to a member of the Chicago City Council. Other people have asked me more about sort of historic things. So I'm kind of ready to do any of that, and I figure I'll maybe read pieces of things for maybe 10 minutes or 15. That's all. We don't have a lot, and then we can talk. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right, throw out what you want me to read about. I saw a few heads shaking about city council transition.
Well, the transition is really interesting.
Yeah.
I'm kind of interested in just neighborhood organizing in uptown.
Okay, I think I can do a little of both, maybe. I think I went through this today trying to figure out where these different connections were.
And then as a member of the council, dealing with the challenges of the personalities and
Okay.
willing to draw the line in terms of compromising to move your agenda forward, et cetera.
Okay, I will. So there. Okay. I'm going to start with that, and then maybe try and incorporate it a little bit of that organizing in Uptown. So let me say this, just as the machine. So I came to Uptown in 1972. I was recruited there to join the Intercommunal Survival Committee. It was the beginning, and there were people recruited from Chicago, from Racine, Wisconsin, where I was organizing, and from St. Louis, where there was a small group of people who were working with the East St. Louis chapter of the Black Panther Party. We were recruited to come to Chicago. The idea really had originally been a concept that Fred Hampton had before he was killed. Bobby Rush and Slim Coleman basically decided to do this. They recruited us. We came to Chicago, and that was the beginning of it. Chicago, or what I did in Chicago, that was the beginning of my time in Chicago. Uptown had the largest concentration of poor white people in the city, and it was a likely place for us to go. It was also only one of two communities where there were actually integrated census tracts. Chicago, as you may know, is a pretty segregated city. Really following as a result of urban policies of the city, which is not unlike other cities, but it was pretty extreme there. In 1972, it was Uptown had a large concentration of poor whites. It had a large concentration of Native Americans, one of the largest in an urban area. It had mostly seniors, but multiple numbers of people who had come from Arizona and California from internment camps, Japanese Americans who migrated, who came to Chicago through uptown. It was a port of entry for people a lot over time. It also had the about 4,000 units of the HUD mortgaged low-income and moderate-income housing units that were built in the 60s and 70s, which by the time I became alderman were at issue because they were all threatened with being taken over by private developers and turned into market rate housing. But they contained 4,000 families in the general uptown area in 1972, and they were from every continent, from all over the country, from all over the city. And the one thing all of the people that I've just mentioned had in common was that they really didn't intend to be moved. They had had enough with displacement. The other group of people that were in uptown, and the other thing about uptown was it had the oldest black community outside of the historic Chicago black belt since the 40s. There's a story about that in the book. I won't go into it right now. Anyway, so and also the Puerto Rican community, which had been moving north, was now on the very southern tip of uptown in large concentrations on their way to be moved actually west into a couple of other communities where they still are pretty much in Chicago, but still fighting their same path of gentrification. So that was kind of the story. The policy of the city was to build things that were allegedly for people, like a city college, a health clinic, a middle school, and to promise the world and promise that these were being built there for the people living there, but invariably they were designated to be built on the land where people lived so that when they were done, people weren't there to live there. That became a theme for me, and it became kind of a thing I was going to prove you could actually do something and make sure that the people you claimed you were doing it for could benefit from it. So that's sort of background or context a little bit. So we were, you couldn't do anything in Uptown without being confronted by the Democratic machine in the early 70s. And that was really true quite through the 80s. Things started to change when Harold Washington was elected because he challenged the machine. But they were very manipulative, very controlling, and impacted people's lives daily. I almost immediately started canvassing door to door. One of the things I was canvassing with was a Black Panther paper. We were trying to recruit people to get a subscription so that we could do home distribution, and we came back every week and we told them about the programs we were developing, and we talked to them and heard the needs they had and then developed programs accordingly with them. And also talked about what was in the paper. And the very first time I started doing this, very first time I went out, the housing conditions were horrific. And I remember getting into lots of conversations about the condition of people's homes and in apartments. And we started talking about organizing and blah, blah, blah. The next time I came the week later, almost nobody would open their door to me. And I got in anyway. Ultimately, what I realized was that the machine precinct captain had followed behind me and threatened everybody, whatever it was. Sometimes it was their welfare, sometimes it was their paycheck, sometimes, who knew? Sometimes it was the rent in the very apartment. So that's just for context. Okay, fast forward, 1983. Before I fast forward, we very early on considered elections as another survival program. I mean, I had to deal with politics, but we really did consider elections as a survival program. It wasn't that they were going to solve all the problems, but they were part of survival pending revolution. In other words, you had to engage in the political reality or you could never do anything. You couldn't create power. That was the heart and the basis of power in the city. So we often got involved in elections if there were elections with a purpose, if you will. So in the mid-'70s, we worked on Chacha Jimenez, the founder of the Young Lords organization. He came back from being underground, dealt with most of his legal questions, was still convicted felon. We ran him for alderman. He wanted to run for alderman anyway. We supported it. We worked with him. He ran in the 46th ward. He did much better than anyone thought. Some of us thought he might win, but that we didn't care. I mean, it wasn't like that was going to be we did care, but it wasn't going to be the determining factor about whether or not we supported him. It was part of a survival program and a vehicle to really communicate with a lot of people and deal with a lot of issues. In 1978, there was the alderman of the ward that we were in, the same one Chacha ran in, resigned, and there was a special election. And long story short, I ended up being selected. It wasn't really my idea to be, we needed to run someone, and I was it. And that ended up being a 3-election year because that was in April of 78. In February, April or May, in February of 79 was the regular municipal elections. And in April of 79 was so maybe it was a year. In April of 79 was the runoff. I did very well ultimately in the municipal election, but I didn't get 51%, 50 plus 1% of the vote. I got 47%, and lost the runoff by about 200. Over time, and not much time later, because the work we continued and we developed a lot of support, and a lot of people from the machine came over, and we learned how we had lost 2,500 votes about. So we were able in future elections to protect those votes, and therefore I was able to ultimately win when I ended up running in 1987. Now, I swore off elections. I swore I'd never run again. We were very involved in Harold Washington's election. We were very involved in citywide campaigns and coalitions all through the late 70s and all into the early 80s, which had a big impact, and we interact with people all over the city. There's several chapters in the book that describe all the things and the conditions that led to Harold Washington's election. I'm not going to go into them right now, but the real point was that we had Old Man Daley died. He was replaced by his alderman, who then lost the election to a so-called independent, Jane Byrne, who turned out not to be very independent at all and created a huge backlash because of her policies, all of which I talk about, and the organizing that went around those issues, both in Uptown as well as throughout the city, that led to a demand that was initiated from the Black community for a candidate that the Black community could support. Harold Washington was top on the list. He said he wouldn't run unless 50,000 new voters were registered and $100,000 was raised. There were a handful of Black millionaires, a handful, like 3, in Chicago. They joined with a few other people and created a fundraising committee and committed and raised that $100,000. Ed Gardner, who was the head of Soft Sheen, put all of his entire design team together to do a voter registration drive, which was called Come Alive October 5. And our coalitions throughout the city that had been very engaged in very grassroots stuff and in issues around housing, education, and especially the city's master plan to whiten the inner city that we all had sort of joined in a coalition around. And also, almost all of us also were dealing with welfare and welfare rights and unemployment issues because there was a lot of changing in the economy during that period of time, and a lot of factories were moving out, and people weren't being protected and were losing their pensions, et cetera. So someone that we worked with came up with the idea that we should go to the unemployment and the welfare offices and register people to vote. And you couldn't register to vote when I got to Chicago except one day, 30 days before any given election or downtown. But during the 70s, there were civic organizations that were really pushing this, and we also had a legal program and got our lawyers into it. And there were a lot of changes by then that were on the verge of occurring, and we basically took advantage of that and ended up with literally registrars at every welfare and employment office in the city, and with temporary tables all over the place. But also the Board of Election actually brought out their own buses or vans, and in the end, by October 5th, there were 200,000 people who had registered to vote who had never been registered before. So Harold was our candidate. He didn't announce he was running. He was running for re-election as congressman in the 1st Congressional District of Chicago, and he announced a week later after that election was over. We had been collecting petitions. That's all we did on election day was collect petitions all over the city. Okay, so he immediately ended up, always up until then, I'm actually telling the whole story, but I want to read some of the things you asked about, but I need the context. I don't know what you guys know about Chicago history. Harold, always the Democratic nominee the primary elections for a mayor, always it was assumed that they would be it. That was it. You were elected mayor. Harold ran in 1983 against Rich Daley, the son, and Jane Byrne, and he had the most votes and he won. And the Republican candidate, was a guy named Saul Epton, who was kind of a what do you call it? A moderate Republican. And he ran. He didn't expect to win. They never win. It was just a given. All of a sudden, everybody, a whole bunch of the ward committeemen, Democratic ward committeemen, all the white ones, jumped on his banner. And it became a very nasty, vicious, racist campaign. And ultimately, Harold won. And immediately, the ward committeemen, the aldermen who were also ward committeemen, who were on the city council and who won, two Eddies in particular, Eddie Burke and Eddie Verdoliak, organized, we have 50 aldermen, organized 29 of the 50 to basically obstruct Harold everywhere they could. The main thing they were able to do was to hold up appointments to boards and commissions, which was really important because in Chicago everything is separate. At that time, the mayor appointed all the commissions to the park district, to the school district, there were a zillion of them. That just made decisions about stuff. But the two that were actually most impactful, the Chicago Housing Authority, the Board of Education, and the Park District, all of which were controlled by the machine, all of which functioned very poorly, if at all, in Black, Latino, and poor and working communities of the city. That was just a given. And so there were very few resources available, and the parks were in horrible shape, the schools were in terrible shape, and resources were hard to find, except in the majority white areas of the city that were also middle class or more. So it was a very big deal that they were holding up those commissions and those votes, but he actually he was a really good politician. He knew how to manipulate, he knew how to go directly to the people, which then forced the alderman to go along. And so I learned a lot from him in terms of this question of transitioning. That was his first term. At the end of his first term, towards the end of his first term, there was a special election that was held that changed the balance of the city council as a result of the gerrymandering of the wards after the 1980 census. And there was an election, and it ended up that there were now the council was split 25-25. And he came calling. He said, "You have to run." He really leaned on me, and ultimately, because I knew I could defeat the guy, Harold Washington interacted with a lot of our work during the 70s, or we interacted with his. So so ultimately, I knew I could beat the guy who was our alderman, who was also part of the 29, and then his opposition consistently. And also one of the people who are our point person to deal with our issues of housing and displacement. So I agreed. And that's why I ran for alderman and became his 26th vote. So now I'm going to read some. Okay. Whew. With my election in April, sorry. And I know I'm talking fast. I'm always told to slow down. I just remembered that. I'll try. Okay. Okay. With my election on April 7th, 1987, Harold Washington was guaranteed a 26-vote majority in the city council. He assured me he would now have a comfortable majority of 40 on most matters, and he did, but he wasn't going to let any grass grow. Rules of procedure for the new city council and its committees, along with their respective chairs, vice chairs, and members, had to be agreed to and voted on. Okay, then we did that, blah, blah, blah. I'm just skipping ahead. On May 4th, the official inauguration day, after a celebratory second swearing in at the Bandshell in Grant Park, we all returned to City Hall. Following the mayor's reception on the 5th floor, we headed to the 2nd floor where I chose my office. This involved confirming furniture and office equipment, an IBM electric typewriter, telephones, and a fax machine, and collecting what was possible from offices vacated by departing aldermen. Coffee machines, office supplies, file cabinets, and anything else that was lying around and not yet claimed. I also arranged for the office to be swept for electronic listening devices or bugs. The sweep revealed that the phones were in fact bugged. The office I was moving into had been the office of an alderman who had been indicted for insurance fraud, and the bugs could have been a remnant of his occupancy. Still, I had become used to my phone being electronically monitored, and I decided to assume the worst, that they were there for me. There was a lot of schmoozing and politicking going on, with lots of handshakes, a few hugs. After securing my office, I moved toward the lobby of the second floor. A fellow alderman, who was one of the original 21 aldermanic allies of Mayor Washington, pulled me toward him, put his arms around my shoulder, bent down, and whispered in my ear, "Now that you're here, it's time to go along to get along." He might as well have said, "Make no waves," a disposition that was not really in my nature. I wasn't elected to make no waves. I was elected to fight for a just and fair city where all voices are heard, where development would occur without displacement, and institutional racism and institutional corruption would be challenged and addressed. I grabbed my acting chief of staff and headed for the elevators, telling him, "We're going back to Uptown and only coming back here for council meetings and committee meetings. We're going to put together the best service office possible. We'll figure out how things work and don't work for real people and let that be our guide." There were several legislative initiatives I was committed to pursue, and I had to set up a functional ward service office. We'd have to learn to walk down two paths at once. This would be easier said than done, but my inner stubborn streak was up for the challenge. So that was my,
What page is that on?
it's a chapter 50. It's called Transition to the Role of Governing, and it's on page 260. That was my perspective as I entered into being an alderman and trying to figure out what that was going to mean, because governing was clearly a different thing. And I do talk specifically, and I'm looking for it, to, I think I found it. To what it took to actually, the challenges. But I think I did this really well here, and I'm looking for it, but otherwise I might have to just explain it. I really had found the perfect thing, and now I had actually found the perfect section to read to answer your question. But that's about the police. Wait. All right, let me see if it's here. My first term was primarily defined by the collective trauma of Harold Washington's death. He died 7 months into my first term. He died in December. He died on November. I should probably read that. Anyway, he died on November 25th, which that year in 1987 was the day before Thanksgiving. So he died like tomorrow. And my birthday is November 24th. And I told him that when I agreed to run that I was going to obviously vote with him, but be a supporter. But I really my focus was going to be development without displacement. So he was trying to, and I had come up with a proposal to basically turn. We had a whole proposal. And it's all written down in here. And it got caught up, and we needed some support from the county board. And it got caught up in a negotiation that the head of the county board, who was also the head of the Democratic Party, was negotiating with Harold about the primary elections coming up in March of 1988. And it was being projected as a dream ticket because it was the first time there was going to be this agreement between the machine and Harold's, both factions of the Democratic Party. And somehow my thing got caught up in the middle of it. And so Harold called me, and plus there was a big issue going on which affected my ward about whether or not there were going to be lights at Wrigley Field. So there were two things happening. Harold called me up that I had to deal with. And that's kind of the point, really. I was always dealing with my issues, but also other issues that were important to some constituents in the ward, and had to weigh all of that. But it was really important. I was going to get to the heart of any matter. So what happened was that the week earlier was our council meeting, and last council meeting, and Harold had called his chief of staff up and said, deputy chief of staff, and said, work with Helen on Wrigley Field. She's come up with a list of, I think it was 15 protections, and I want them all included into the ordinance. And so those were the things that the community there had been a bunch of people meeting and what they wanted. And then he turned to me and he said, I'll get back to you on your stuff. We're almost there. So it's my birthday. He calls me up at 10 o'clock at night and he says, my birthday's the 24th again. And he says, happy birthday and come see me tomorrow at 11. I've got it worked out. So I get to City Hall and I'm right on time and I jump in the elevator and there's Rob Meir, his deputy chief of staff, and he grabs me and he says, what are you doing here? What are you doing here? Because he thought I was coming to talk about his thing. Consequently, I wasn't, so I told him, fine. I was 2 minutes late. So I get to the mayor's office and all hell breaks loose. And I don't know what's going on, and I do write about this, but ultimately he had collapsed at his desk at exactly 11 when I would have been there if I'd been on time. And it was, for me, really devastating. But really, I think it was for millions of people, literally, in Chicago, pretty devastating. And so he died. And I had to, we had to recalibrate what we were doing. So you can read about that in the book. I'm not reading that to you. But that's, so that's what I'm referring to. So my first term was primarily defined by the collective trauma of Harold Washington's death and the incessant hope that the coalition and vision that had driven his campaign would still be ascendant, which wasn't the case. But I'm going to skip around a little bit just so I can get more in. Similarly, my second term had significant, albeit finite, victories both in the council and in the ward, as I and my office remained grounded and tied to organizers and activists who are still active and effective locally and citywide. By the time I was elected to my third term in 1995, my commitment to a career as an elected official, something I never planned or desired, had become clear, and most of that grounding and backup had dissipated. People had left the council to be congressmen, to be state reps, whatever, judges. There's a narrative that for years I was the lone voice against Daley and what remained of the machine. This, of course, was never true, but when people tell that story, they were talking about the years from 1995 to 1999 when I cast the sole vote against the city budget, and sometimes it felt like they were right. My staff in the first two terms had mostly consisted of folks with the history and context of earlier struggles. Now, in the late 90s, they were replaced with a solid group of people committed to social change and serving the people, but they weren't the 24/7 cadre I had grown to rely on. They had lives, basically. The fading away of our community institutions, what I mean by that is the things were transitioning, left me untethered. There were, I didn't say it here, actually I skipped it, but there were some institutions that had a much longer legs, but there was a period of transition going on. My young staff were committed to social change and embraced the challenge to be bureaucracy busters in service of our constituents. But our ward was divided and gentrification was outpacing any attempts to stem the tide. This dynamic had a life of its own that brought with it a mean spirit that weighed heavily on all of us. There was a period of time, I'm skipping again, the next 9 months, this was in 1998, saw Mark, who some of you may know, Mark Zalkin, die from complications of multiple sclerosis, the birth of my granddaughter Justice, and the marriage of her parents, while I cobbled together a staff and began what would be a decade-long process to realize the Wilson Yard development and the prospects of another election if I was to run for a fourth term. So a lot about that development later on. It was my proof that you could do development for the people who are currently living there and they could realize it. And the election, there was an election coming up a year later in 1999. Our kids had, for a few years, basically shortly after I became alderman, it said to all of us who'd been doing all sorts of recreation and education programs to step aside, and they created something called the Uptown Youth Force, and then something called Youth on Youth, which was they all started studying to be teachers and started training teachers and doing it by teaching their younger brothers and sisters and then their younger brothers and sisters. So they had been doing this for a few years, and that's what I reference here. The next generation was in full gear with their work. In 1997, Youth on Youth was thriving. Dozens of the present and former participants were in school to become teachers, and there were many community institutions that existed before us that were marching on. The revolution we had envisioned 30 years earlier had not happened. In its place was a revolution in technology that I didn't quite understand. My skills, relationships, and impact now were firmly planted in my understanding of city government, of its budget, and of how to impact city policy. But I needed to come to peace with leaving the structures and grounding of the 70s and 80s that had guided so much of my work in the past and find that grounding in the work of the next generation and other leaders in the community. I also had to relearn an important lesson, to choose humility over the prestige of power. Indeed, such power is elusive and self-serving at best. There were simply things I could not control. The retrenchment of power in the machine and right-wing forces was out of my control, but I could continue to hold them accountable and provide fodder to activists through the budget hearing process. There were only so many things I could do in Uptown to ensure that those most affected had a say, but I would keep doing them. I would focus on the things I could impact and be intentional about connecting with the people in the community doing the work. I had learned important lessons. Do no harm. Remember that every action, every law passed, every policy implemented has unintended consequences, and that sometimes these consequences outweigh the benefit of whatever the original goal was. Define public policy from the perspective of those most affected. Use the benefit of a positive material impact for those with the fewest resources to evaluate positions on legislative decision-making. These realizations would fuel my work for 3 more terms. Okay. Did I answer your question? I mean, I don't know. There's more in it, but I hope that spoke to your thing. So, ask me stuff or talk. Let's chat. Hi, Louis. You want to know stuff about well, whatever. Ask. Yeah.
When I was there, they had model cities.
Mhm.
Did that still continue?
Yeah. One of the model cities, I assume it was all over the country, was a federal program that identified, and in Chicago they identified, I think it was 5 communities. Uptown was the only one that was majority white. That was part of it because Uptown, it was very in great need for model cities. But again, the Model Cities Council was controlled by the machine, and almost all the programs that they did were programs that benefited the gentrification of the area, what we called at the time displacement or urban renewal. They called it urban renewal, and we called it urban removal. So one of the things about the Model Cities Council was that there had been a proposal to build a city college, which now is called Truman College, right where on a huge square block area with the intention of taking over 4 square blocks. And there was huge community opposition. Lots of negotiations went on. The white liberals really had the edge on that negotiation, and they agreed to a compromise that still removed most of those folks. In 1970, that was going on, and there was a mass organization called Voice of the People that did a lot of welfare rights stuff as well as housing, and they were very much a part of the grassroots effort against these policies. They found an architect who put together a people's plan called the Hank Williams Village for that area that included housing, job training, recreation. It was huge. And and part of it was going to take a 2-block area on the street on Sunnyside, if you remember it, and turn it into a mall that was going to be sort of the center of these activities where the housing was, and it was going to include many of the other stuff, and it was all related. This Model Cities Council only adopted the mall, so-called mall. They redefined it, and they basically spent a chunk of money on making it a cement slab. He was just making it a cement. So the street became a cement mall, and on it were a bunch of planters that were built with the freeze line in the wrong place. So the only thing that could grow there basically were those plants that you make switches out of, you know? And then they built cement figures of animals that were theoretically for playing on, and they put at the bottom of these sort of a foam base that, of course, was destroyed, disintegrated within minutes. And really those became like the best place for people to urinate, apparently. And there's a picture in the book of kids on one of these because during the 70s, we took over the another Model Cities program, which was summer lunch programs, because the food that they were serving people, the kids was rotten. It was like rotten bologna. It had turned colors already. So we basically took over the program and did it outside on all of the playgrounds, which were in horrible condition, but it's where the kids were, and they all came out, and we did it on the mall. So there's a picture of them. It's some kids with their lunches sitting on this equipment that I know had just been urinated on. But anyway, it was like, so the Model City, we actually ran people in the Model Cities election. We ran in Uptown, and the Black Panther Party had a slate in Grand Crossing on the south side. In the Model Cities election in order to be able to try and challenge the power. But yeah, they were still there.
Yeah, I was campaigning for independent candidates. for
Yeah,
Model City.
yeah.
A lot of kids were Appalachian.
Yes, they were. Most of the poor whites that lived in Uptown were from the South. Yeah. You were going to ask me something?
Yeah, well, first, thanks for doing this because, the real history has to be told someday.
Yeah.
And hopefully somebody learns from it. So you've had
Thank
probably one of the most sustained political experiences of the people I know anyhow.
So thank you.
Social
Thank you.
justice. What, so now we're in
Yeah.
a period of total craziness.
Yep.
And it's hard to figure what the pathway forward is. And do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, I have a lot. It's kind of why I wrote the book. I first of all, I think that we're kind of in a defensive position. To me, this last election that we had was just about being defensive. Okay, so what happened with in Chicago with Harold Washington and the way the media responded and the way in which racism displayed itself in the legislative bodies in that first term, I think was it was a precursor to what happened nationally when Barack Obama was elected, and then when Trump was elected. But it probably actually went back to Newt Gingrich also. I mean, it was just a lot of the same motivations, different conditions that existed in different places that the elected officials were in relationship to these issues. But, they kind of represent some of the evolution of things. But I think Chicago really foreshadowed what was to come. And so I feel like this has been a fight I've been in for a very long time. And for me, the best model really, in my experience, was the Black Panther Party, because the 10-point platform and program was such a clear and method of work that we learned were such. They were, as I internalized them and as I read the book, and then when I got to the end of the book, realized that they had really, it was that experience and that practice that had really allowed me to maintain and have my own plumb line, and to really be able to have the tools that I needed to be able to figure out what to do in the given moment, both individually and collectively. I think the concept of a united front these days is really important. I think that we have to. I think that we have to realize that these are prolonged struggles, but that doesn't mean that there aren't things that we need to do every day in order to move forward as opposed to backwards. But I think it's a forward movement. I think our past informs the present, and allows us to be able to move forward. But we can't repeat the past. I mean, it's not like, a lot of times we say, oh, this is what we did, we should do it again. Well, maybe, but we better think of it in the context of what is actually the reality today, and moving forward. So I think that we have to, and we shouldn't make assumptions, and we can't get stuck, because part of what we are experiencing today is an extreme polarization that has been really generated by folks that are really much more interested in going backwards. I don't think there's any doubt that this whole conversation about the originalist, or whatever terms they use it, Constitution. I mean, what was the original Constitution? The original Constitution said you're only a citizen if you own property, which means you're rich, if you're white, and if you're a man. That's it. And if you want to go back to the original Constitution and you want to ignore the fact that there was the opportunity, there was not only a Bill of Rights, but there was an opportunity for that Bill of Rights to be expanded and to broaden and to include more people. And if you want to go back to the original Constitution and not acknowledge that there were political agreements that were made and concessions that were made in order to allow for slavery to not only exist but to thrive, then become the very part of the DNA of the country. If you want to go back to the originalists, that's what you want. And that represents the most right-wing, crazy aspect, in my view, of this country, but it's embedded in its very foundation. So we're not going to be able to win that fight unless we're really able to address this in a manner that gets people talking about it. And the polarization that we face makes that very difficult. So it's up to us, anyone who wants to move forward and wants to not just sustain the gains that have been made all this time in law, but to actually experience and create the internalization of those gains and the ongoing need and response to the need to broaden them. And if that's who we are, then we have to be doing the same level of organizing and the same level of conversation and the same level of changing minds that I think the extreme right, has been very effective over. Now, they were helped by a crazy man in the White House who gave them credibility and a platform. But that's going to happen because there's always a status quo, because the origins of the country are embedded in the status quo. So there's so much that we still have to deal with. And the status quo, it's like gravity, it's there, and you don't make change without creating friction. And when you're doing that, it can be confusing to people. And if you have a lot of money and you're multi-billionaires and you can spend it confusing people, that makes our job harder. But it doesn't mean that we don't have to do it. So I look at it this way. For me, what I've always done is if I'm feeling, I guess I've done this my whole life, I just put words to it when I got older. If you're feeling encircled, if you're feeling like you're stuck, you're feeling like the world is caving in on you, the only thing to do is literally break out of the encirclement. You just have to do it. And I do that in my mind, and then I just regroup. And I do that with everyone around me who I can get to have the conversation with and who I'm working with, because it just means it means that we just have to find the way. To me, there's a solution for everything. We just may not know what it is. And everything in a positive way, but we may not know what that is. And when we find it, we may not know if it works, or we think we find it. We may have to do the practice. And in our environment, part of the polarization and part of our political environment is to be fearful of acknowledging a mistake, because everything is so superficial. So if you're an elected official and you say, we tried this and it didn't work, your opponents are going to just attack you left and right. So no one does it. Well, almost no one does it. But if you're communicating and if you have the interaction with people, it's really important that you're able to say this worked or didn't work. Because honestly, how do we learn? We learn by making mistakes. We learn and correcting them. We learn by trying something out. If it were, so we used to say, we need to, as a collective, we used to say, if we need to have the conversation, come to an agreement, and make a decision that this is going to be the policy that we're going to do on any given thing. And then we need to carry it out wholeheartedly. And if it works, then we know that was the right decision. And if it doesn't work, that's fine. Then we've learned that isn't the right decision, or it wasn't the right way to do it. It doesn't change what our goal is. It just changed the way we're going to get to it. Now we know that doesn't work. We're going to try something else. But you can't do that unless you try it wholeheartedly. And in the political arena, it's really hard to engage the media, your colleagues, almost anybody in the deeper conversation. Everything is superficial. I mean, the joke among the press corps, especially the press corps that actually wanted to cover me, was that I could never say a soundbite. So it was like, they were always trying to get me to say a soundbite. And if it was a reporter who really didn't like me, there was one reporter, City Hall reporter, who always took her a tape recorder with her. And I knew she was looking for something she could quote. So I made sure I was doing an anti-apartheid legislation, and I knew she didn't agree with it, but she was going to write it because she was a City Hall reporter. And I knew that she didn't understand the issue. So I knew that I wasn't going to get even a handful, close to an accurate article unless I explained it to her. So I spent at least a half hour every time she put the thing in front of me, just telling her the issues, but doing it in a way that she had nothing to quote me on until I got to give her enough information that I felt I could then do it. It was crazy, but for me, it's too easy. And in Chicago, okay, I don't know about the rest of the country, but in Chicago, Alinsky organizing is a big deal because Alinsky came from Chicago. And Alinsky organizing to me is like a lot of things. it gives you some structures, but which are useful. But the way he did it was terrible. It was very opportunistic, had terrible content, and he was very close to the machine. A lot of what he did really furthered the conditions that existed in the city, but more importantly than not, gave a lot of organizations a vehicle that encouraged them, or an encouragement to go after something that made them look good. So here would be the problem. They would be working on it. Might be a really good one, and they might have a really good campaign, and sometimes they really did. Often they really did. But in the end, if they were going to negotiate something, it wasn't about getting a material impact that was the heart of solving that problem. It was about how to get the most publicity for who they were so they could raise more money. And that was how it worked in Chicago with a lot of organizations. And that was kind of the way people thought about it. They thought about it that way in the nonprofit or activist community, and they thought about it in the political community just as being kind of, we're going to tell people what they want to hear, different kinds of opportunism, but we're going to tell people what they want to hear and then get to the next subject, especially if it's controversial. And so for me, it was about, okay, we used to call that, we had a name for it that was based on an alderman. One alderman, we used to call it his two-step. That was our shorthand for that. For me, it was about identifying the problem and engaging people in the solution to it by looking at the most severe manifestation, but making sure you looked at the consequences beyond that, because everything we do has a consequence, and we didn't want the collateral. I don't like when the collateral impacts make a worse problem that you have to solve. So for me, I did a lot of stuff that made it much harder, because in order to do that, you have to you have to allow people to have input. And especially as the internet got developed, there was lots of ways that people would go crazy on me just because they were opposed to me and didn't want to have low-income housing, or they didn't want to do the apartheid stuff, or they didn't want to pass the human rights legislation, whatever. And they would go really crazy on me, or they didn't like how I dealt with the police, or my criticisms of police misconduct. So I gave them a voice. I gave everyone a voice, which meant they had a voice too. So it's harder, and it's much harder to do, but I think it's really important that there be an ability to be able to break that down. So the last thing I'll say on that is that I think that whatever we do, it's always effective if it has to be one step at a time. We can't really jump. You can't really jump from A to Z. It doesn't work. We really have to go through the process. We have to do whatever we have to do every day, and whatever that is for anyone. And if it's forward moving, then ultimately that will be helpful. Some people will be more organized. Some people will be less organized. Some people will be part of a united front or a specific coalition or whatever. But I think that it is that conversation that begins to win over more hearts and minds of people who are just confused about what's happening, or have been totally enthralled in whatever this craziness is, in resistance to change. But that's my thing. So I really wrote the book so I could say that. A current mayor. I think Chicago has some serious problems, and some of the problems we have not solved, and most of the promises made have not been met. Let me put it that way. The biggest problem we have in Chicago is how we deal with public safety. We don't. And always, for me, that meant having a stable community, which meant giving people an opportunity to really make a choice about where they were going to live and to be able to stay in the community where they were living. And so that has so many aspects to it. But since there's a picture in the book of some aldermen, I was there. I might have even taken the picture. I mean, I was an alderman there, and I was part of what the press conference was, but I'm not in the picture. But it's of several people, including Chuy Garcia, who's now a congressman, and Danny Davis, in a press conference decrying Daley's successful effort at closing the Chicago Addiction Treatment Center, which was an incredibly successful program for addiction and mental health. And it was the first salvo, as I recall, or one of the first salvos in eliminating and closing down all our mental health centers, which the city had multiple ones. And that was done under Daley. as was the beginning of the privatization of the schools. Rahm Emanuel came in and closed down 50 schools, all neighborhood schools, and really leaving communities high and dry. And Daley had already started a big effort on charter stuff. Actually, Arnie Duncan, who is his what do you call it, head of the school system. And there's a little story about our struggle in Uptown because we were working with our kids who had done all the stuff with education, wanted to take the school they had gone to and transform it, which ultimately happened. But Arnie Duncan wanted to be a charter school, and I had to go over. I got Daley to agree with me. Not sure how. Anyway, that was. All those things were happening. So there's this progression that's been going on with all these different mayors, and there's consistently a theme of police misconduct and issues with it. It was, I was able to have a big impact on the city council and ultimately develop a working relationship with Daley, which was remarkable actually because he didn't know how to deal with me. Large on almost every issue, on housing, specifically on some of the school stuff, but never when it came to police misconduct or so-called community policing or any kind of accountability. And
Are you talking about Daley Jr.?
yes, yeah.
He was already, the other guy was gone.
Yeah, he died in 76. So he died in December 76. So Daley, yeah. So that hasn't changed. And one of the but it hasn't. The policies didn't change, and there are several chapters that talk about the police, both before and after I was alderman. And one of the things that I actually, and my effort, I actually have a couple of. I was going to read it, but I didn't. A couple of paragraphs about one regret that I have, and I rarely say I have a regret. Was about not having more of an impact on the contract with the police. But I write a lot about that history. The point being that we had, I'm sure you heard about Laquan McDonald, who was killed with 16 shots, and they actually finally put someone in jail for something. But it happened in Rahm Emanuel's first term, and he hid it. It was hidden, and it came out right after his reelection, and it was huge. It was a very big deal, and it was pre-George Floyd, and there were all sorts of things happening in Chicago as a result of that, including a consent decree that the Obama administration got signed, but also we were always changing the so-called oversight group, which now supposedly is going to be elected. We'll see. I'm not sure anyone's running yet, but we have an election on that in February. But it's all been bullshit, and it's all been the same thing over and over again. And Rahm appointed Lori Lightfoot to be the head of this commission that was going to look at police misconduct. And she was also on the police board. I'm not sure how that happened. And anyway, she turned on him and made that the heart of her campaign. Now, this is a woman who was a prosecutor, and she made that the heart of her campaign. So weigh it, which way is she going to go? When she became mayor, she basically went back on her word on almost all of that, and hired a police superintendent from Dallas, I think, who's never been really. Neither one of them are from Chicago, and Chicago has its own culture in a lot of ways. But his whole modus operandi is just to blame the victim. So I think, and so he'll get up, and they have a very low solve rate on most crimes, but definitely on any murders. They don't. 17%, I think, is the solve rate. Plus, we have this history of torture in Chicago, and police torture. So we have millions of dollars that are spent every year still on people who've been exonerated, who are beat up tortured into confessions by this guy named John Burge and all the police that worked with him on the South Side District. But they ended up being all over the city. So we have this incredibly horrific history, and it just seems to go on and on and on. And now we have a superintendent who literally, when asked on press conferences about this, his only response that I've ever heard is to say, well, it's because people don't come forward. Now, give me a break. Where in the world is it only a matter of relying on somebody coming and telling you what happened because they happen to be there that you solve crimes? That just doesn't happen. There's very little. So there's very poor. There was privatization of the crime lab when I was alderman by Daley. I have no idea. Actually, I've been gone for 12 years. I'm not really sure who does it now, but I know that it used to take. They didn't even bother to take fingerprints ever, and except if there was a murder, and then it would take. They'd fingerprint you if you were arrested, but if they took a fingerprint off something, they'd have to send it to a lab, and it would take up to 3 months and a murder to be able to find out if they could identify that fingerprint. I mean, there's no, the DNA testing. Forget, especially on rapes. So. I can't tell you exactly what the status is on all of that today, but I know it hasn't. It's not being utilized, whatever level they have access to technology. And I know that we were spending $50 million a year out of the judgment fund, which never actually was given that much money, so we were always in arrears, on police misconduct cases my last year. I believe that it's up to $100 million on some years since then. And so the amount of money we've spent since I left the city council is well over $1 billion, I'm sure, and just growing. And meanwhile, they had to raise the property taxes a year ago in order to be able to get caught up, and not quite caught up, on the police pension. So it's crazy, and resistance to going back and having any kind of interaction with mental health people instead of the police and responding to mental health stuff, which has resulted in multiple people being killed and multiple multi-million-dollar lawsuits that we're also paying. So I'm not really encouraged by the current administration. And I haven't said that publicly before because she's very vindictive, and I am involved in some in some community organizations, and hopefully that's fine. But it's really a problem. And there's a lot of people running, and they're all filing their petitions this week. And next week we'll know who's going to be running, but there'll probably be at least 10 candidates. And I have to see who's running. There's a few people I think that could have the capacity to be much better mayors. We'll see if they actually, I don't know. I never talk about who I like till I know who's on the ballot. So. Okay, a couple minutes.
Yeah, that was a packed hour.
I know. I talk fast too. Yeah. I'm sorry, what?
I was curious about your earlier organizing, community organizing, and you briefly mentioned the Young Lords.
Yeah.
Are there some lessons that we can learn from the Young Lords and community organizing, even in cities like San Francisco?
Yeah, I think that, so the signature about the Young Lords, I think, was a couple things. One is that they were standing their ground on what they called urban removal in Lincoln Park, community in Chicago, which is now very wealthy. And they were deeply committed to the independence of Puerto Rico, or self-determination of people of Puerto Rico, which is how they put it. And they were the subject, as almost everyone was who was active in the late 60s, of attacks by the police, and some of their members were murdered. And they went underground. There was a huge amount of repression in Chicago in the late 60s, which I think people know. And I think it was probably after Fred Hampton was murdered, and but around the same time they went underground. And Chacha came out in 72, and that was the beginning of doing what needed to be done so he could run for alderman. And so I do talk about this a little bit in the book. They really focused on public safety, and in that part of the ward where we were that was heavily Puerto Rican, and they had an office, and the people who were living upstairs were constantly harassed by the police, and that was because there was a lot of drug dealing going on that block. So they took on, just Chacha had come out of a gang. So the Young Lords was originally a gang, and unlike the Black Panther Party, which was organized as a political organization, the Young Lords and also in Uptown before we got there, the Young Patriots had been gangs, and they organized politically to transform themselves. So they were always part of what they did was organizing the gang members, just like Fred had tried to do positive, to be engaged in the community organizing and in the programs that were beneficial to the community. And that was really important. And there were people all over the city. I talk in the book about Marion Stamps, who was in Cabrini Green, and she was like responsible not just for gang truces there, but multiple citywide gang truces. Every time anyone did this, whether it was the Young Lords or Marion Stamps or anyone on the South Side, and the police would go ballistic and crazy on them. And so I think that almost as a sign of the things that really need to be done if we're going to transform these things. But we have to find a way not to have someone else define it for us. Just like we have to write our own history, we have to write our own story as we do it. And we have to make sure that we're not too polarized so we can't have the conversation to be able to get people to understand what we're really talking about. And so I do talk about some of the details of that in the book, especially with what Chacha tried to do there. And there's a funny kind of aside because the commander that really would have nothing to do with them, there's a few stories about him that are kind of cool. Yeah. Thank you. All right. I guess we're out of time.
Thank you, Helen. Yeah,
Thank you.
Squeeze you in. Keep chatting.
Yeah.
Feel free.
Yeah.
We are going to roll over into another program, but we have the books here. So if you want,
Where's she signing?
Oh, yeah. I can't.
probably at that end of the room. That makes sense. Okay. Yeah. All right. We'll need your bag. Thanks a lot.
Thank
You bet.
So,
Thank
and
you. Yeah.
yeah. Perfect.
I'll carry these towards that end of the room.
Okay.
Great. That was fabulous. I'm going to stop the recording and then we'll have that.
And you're going to archive the video?
Yeah, it'll be available.
Carol is the other person.
Oh, no, I'm trying to learn. And also, I think we have a mutual friend. You know James Tracy, right? Yes. Yeah, his class is going on tonight.
Yeah,
So-
they can't. I saw him Sunday.
Yeah, he mentioned that there was an event in Berkeley.
With people, yes, with some of the folks from Madison.
Okay, so since, oh, it was Oakland, okay. So, I think he'll forgive me for skipping his class. I sent him a text.
Yes, for sure. Let me know if he does.
I'm going to take it.
Well, I have evidence